Forward.
Welcome to today's meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted as chairman of Cityforum to welcome you all to this discussion on political challenges, which is part of our cyber work being organized for the 12th year in succession with the help of the NSA, and this year, happily, with the assistance of Wilton Park, who are co-sponsoring. The session is to be chaired by Sir David Omand, who looked after our first discussion in this series, and we're delighted to have him coordinating our conversation, and are so pleased to observe that his book, How Spies Think, has been so well received by sort of journalists and critics interested in the subject. We always do well when David chairs us. We have 5 excellent contributors today. Congressman James Langevin, whom we've been sort of hoping to have on our platform for a number of years, and we're delighted to have him this year to sort of give us his overview. Then James Brokenshire, Minister of State for Security, who has spoken at various points as his ministerial responsibilities have led him in our direction at Cityforum events on policing and cyber in the past. Then we're delighted to have Dominic Grieve with us as former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, who's spoken extremely well for us on a number of occasions. Kiersten Todt, Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute, is joining us. She's somebody we've wanted to invite to speak for us for a number of years. And Adam Hadley is joining us, founder of the Online Harms Foundation and expert on cyber and terrorism, who comes as the Wilton Park sort of contributor to the panel today. Both the Congressman and the Minister have diary conflicts, which makes it impossible for them to stay throughout this meeting. And so we're cancelling the short break between the panel presentations and the discussion and going straight on into the discussion, which means I think that the discussion will end slightly sort of earlier than the time that was advertised. But David is in command of that part of it, and we're guided by him as ever. It would be helpful if you could start putting your questions and comments in via our chat arrangements. And the afternoon's proceedings are open and not subject to the strict Chatham House dispensations which normally apply to our events. David, delighted that you could spare the time to be with us again. We have an excellent panel, a most interesting group of people from many parts of the world taking part in the event today, and hope for a session which is as good and helpful as the one which George Barnes of NSA sort of opened our series with a couple of weeks ago. David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. I'm David Omand. I will be chairing this event. Can I start by reminding everyone that this event is on the record. The event is being recorded, but only for the purpose of helping the note takers. We're going to start, I'm delighted to say, with some keynote remarks from Congressman Langevin, and then James Brokenshire. I'll then turn to Dominic, Kiersten at that point, and then Adam Hadley to round us off. And you already have their biographies in your digital packs, so I won't take time up to read them out. You, as the audience, will be muted with videos off whilst the speakers are giving their presentations, and then we'll move, as Mark has said, straight into the Q&A. I invite you to use the chat function of Zoom, send in your questions or comments at any point from now onwards. Just to perhaps situate our discussion, this event is a reminder, if one were needed, of just how dependent we all are for our economic and social health on the internet and the web, on our mobile devices and the social media they connect us to. We've all used online purchasing, particularly to see us through lockdowns. We've used online communications to stay in touch with loved ones. I just think, what would it have been like this year if technology had not been able to cope with the increased demand, or if repeated security breaches and disasters had ended up destroying people's confidence, especially for remote working. It's not an exaggeration, I think, to talk of our dependence on this bundle of technologies, so it's imperative we keep them secure from those who want to exploit the internet to cause us harm. And as we've discussed before in Cityforum, a priority for our intelligence agencies must be to uncover the threats in the so-called grey zone that lies between genuine peace and armed conflict, and to help frustrate the sophisticated criminal gangs that are exploiting the internet. To use an acronym I coined, I call this draining the cesspit, dealing with crime, espionage, sabotage, and subversion, perverting internet technology. Crime, like North Korea manipulating the SWIFT interbanking system to try to steal over $700 million from Bangladesh. Espionage, like the Chinese PLA unit hacking into the US Office of Personnel Management to steal the vetting records of American public servants. Sabotage, like the Russian GRU hacking into the Kiev electricity system to turn the supply off. And subversion, like the Russian covert influence operations on Western electorates. And the current experience of attempts to hack into COVID-19 vaccine labs and spread vaccine disinformation has brought to the surface this underside of the internet and the way that social media allows and amplifies information dangerous for democracy itself. So, turning to the politicians who are in charge, there are many cybersecurity issues confronting them. What do governments need to know to make sound decisions in this area? What should they do? What should they ask citizens and companies, especially those running the critical national infrastructure, to take responsibility for? And what can government do? What do we expect the cloud providers and the giant tech companies to do? And indeed to ask, what are the limits on what in practice can be done faced with the complex multi-stakeholder governance of the internet, faced with the characteristics like user anonymity that are hard baked into the protocols. I was checking up the other day, and it's almost exactly 35 years ago that the US Federal Networking Council kind of christened the internet and agreed the protocols. There are issues such as when governments should make public the attributions by their intelligence communities of responsibility for cyber attacks. And very fundamentally, should we all in the democracies be encouraging a move from cyber defense to active cyber defense to persistent engagement with our adversaries, a form of offensive cyber deterrence, as indeed I think the Solarium Commission was inclined to recommend. So who better to start answering those sort of questions than a leading member of the Solarium Commission, Congressman James Langevin. Over to you, please, to address us.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very clearly.
Excellent. Well, good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. And let me say what an honor it is to be with such an august group. And I want to acknowledge my fellow panelists this morning, especially James Brokenshire, as well as Dominic, Adam, and Kiersten. I look forward to our discussion here today, and thank you for having me. I also just want to take a minute to acknowledge Mike Steinmetz. Mike helped facilitate my participation this morning. I want to thank him for his work as Rhode Island's inaugural cybersecurity advisor, and again, helping to arrange today's event. It really is a treat for me to speak to an audience of cybersecurity experts, and I appreciate the work that you all are doing in your own right. All of us are already on the same page about the seriousness of the cyber threat, the cunning and creativity of our adversaries, and the consequence, of course, of cyber incidents. So each of us has our own role to play in this fight. whether on the operational side or in developing policy. And whether you toil in the trenches or rather at the keyboard, or whether you spend your time reading and writing specifications and reports and presenting and discussing ideas in meetings like this, we all contribute to an important common cause. So let me take this opportunity to share some of my experience and lessons from the viewpoint of an American politician. I'm going to try to be brief. I've been asked to speak for about 10 or 12 minutes or so, so I'm hoping to stay within that time frame and not putting anyone to sleep. So let me get started and say that, I'd like today to cite basically three specific areas of concern. So each of these is both a policy dimension and a political dimension, and each relates to a larger theme with broad implications. So for each of the areas of concern, I'll basically offer a capsule summary or example of our process to date. Some are further along, while others, we are struggling to get our arms around. The first area of concern that I'll touch on involves organizational structure. So what is the challenge of organizational structure in government? Well, let me ask you a question. Whichever country you represent, which agency in your government is responsible for cybersecurity? That's the question. Which agency is responsible for cybersecurity? Well, I think most of us would answer they all are. And I say that because every government agency bears responsibility for cybersecurity, because virtually every function in modern life makes use of computers and computer networks. Of course, there is specialization for various functions like intelligence gathering and analysis, for military operations, for domestic safety, for economic vitality, and foreign relations. In the United States and in most governments, each of these functions has its own dedicated agency. So you can take it as a rule of thumb in government, every agency, of course, wants more power and authority. And this sounds like a recipe for conflict, of course, and certainly there is, but there is a positive way of looking at it in many ways. Actually, you want people to be totally dedicated to their agency mission. You would want and expect every agency to think its mission is in line, its mission is the most important one for, and thus fight for more resources and responsibility. Accordingly, we need ways of gaining a holistic view. And so any collection of governmental agencies offers needs and offices needs organizational structures and processes that will ensure balance and coordination among them. So the Solarium Commission that I was privileged to serve on as one of the four members of Congress looked at the array of agencies and functions that play a role in cybersecurity in the U.S. government. So we concluded that the president needed a person, an office, whose responsibility it is to really solely coordinate among the 24 or so different agencies that all have a role to play in cyber defense and security. Moreover, we had to ensure that this person would yield enough power that they could command influence among the constituent agencies to yield their parochial viewpoints to the whole of government. Let's face it, each department and agency has their own mission, and cybersecurity isn't going to be the primary one for any particular one of them. So we really needed someone in charge to focus on that very critical function of protecting the country, protecting the government, of course, in cyberspace. So we called this new role the National Cyber Director, and we hope to create it within the executive office of the president at the White House. In fact, that's why I'll be leaving a little bit early today, because we have the National Defense Authorization Act on the floor today, which will, among other things, actually authorize the creation of the National Cyber Director that will be Senate confirmed and will be in the executive office of the president. So to my mind, this was one of the highest priority recommendations for the Solarium Commission. We had bipartisan support in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this provision, again, is now made its way through the final version of our Defense Authorization Act. And again, expected to pass the House of Representatives and the Senate this week. And we do expect that it will pass into law if all goes well. Of course, organizational structure is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for success in coordinating across government agencies for cybersecurity. So a second major area of concern is about interdependence in a globalized economy, something important to acknowledge. On the one hand, the laws of economics drive sourcing of goods and services to countries and regions that produce them most cheaply and efficiently. And that creates a more interdependent world, and it distributes the benefits of production broadly. So 60% of the world's population now owns a cell phone. Well, that's a remarkable achievement. But on the other hand, we recognize that several countervailing forces. Overdependence on highly optimized supply chains leads to brittleness in the system. We learned from the COVID pandemic that personal protective equipment and long cotton swabs were manufactured in just a few factories. So overemphasis on cost puts undue leverage in the hands of low-cost suppliers who can corner the market. The 5G telecommunications rollout, of course, has raised an alarm about the security of equipment coming from China. So for these reasons, in October, the Solarium Commission released an additional white paper focused on building a trusted information and communications technology supply chain. So one of the key recommendations of this report is to reinvigorate partnerships with trusted partners and allies in order to improve supply chain security and reliability. In the area of telecommunications, the United States, the UK, and European and global democracies, I believe, really must join together in establishing open standards for 5G so that no single company or country can gain a chokehold on the supply of critical equipment. Now, last month, we passed a bill in the House of Representatives to take steps in this direction and support open RAN standards, which I think is important. More generally, technology and automation force us all to really reevaluate the structure of our economies. And in a world where trade and traffic in bits and bytes is as significant as physical goods, cybersecurity really does become even more significant. So one conclusion we can all agree on is that alliances and cooperation on principles and norms will lead us in the right direction. I really firmly do believe that. What's more, we should all understand that we cannot export control our way out of this problem. We are struggling with Chinese 5G companies in part because we do not have a robust bench of alternatives right now. And that really needs to change. That bench cannot and will not be solely American companies, nor will it be British ones. But for technologies that require additional trust, we need to have a network of suppliers among partners and allies that we can offer in competition to state-supported Chinese companies. So finally, let me raise a third major area of concern relating to trust and common understanding around shared values in the information age. So in the United States, a focal point of this concern has been around our elections. So we know that in 2016, Russian sponsored agents infiltrated certain computer accounts to steal and release information that would be damaging to one of the candidates. And we know that they mounted influence operations designed to attack fracture points in our political landscape. So the United States, of course, is not the only democracy subject to this kind of information warfare. that turns our values and openness and freedom of expression against ourselves. Most recently, our November elections demonstrate mixed success in fighting this problem. One on the positive side, by all accounts, our election was a technical success. The former director of CISA here, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, deemed it to be the most secure elections in U.S. history, and I concur. Outside of normal ranges of human error, all legitimately cast votes were counted, and no fraudulent votes were tabulated. The vast majority of ballots maintained an auditable paper trail. No votes were hacked. No voting systems were significantly disrupted, and all responsible election officials are confident in the correctness and security of the vote. So this success, though, is due in large measure to an agency in the Department of Homeland Security, as I just referenced, called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. So CISA mounted a multi-year effort to work with state and local elections officials to train and advise them on cybersecurity measures. So I credit then Director of CISA, Christopher Krebs, with leading this effort to build not only a technically capable team, but trusted relationships. As the election data arrived, CISA stood up a rumor control website. So this site addressed false narratives about the election and established a factual basis for truth to prevail and from truth, trust in the system. So this brings us, unfortunately, to the negative side of the story, because as we speak, many Americans don't have faith in the outcome of the election. This is due to denial and deliberate misinformation being spread, quite frankly, by President Trump and his associates. I think it's a disservice to democracy and to our country. But I will say that I'm confident that this particular anomaly will pass. Joe Biden will be sworn in as the next president of the United States, and his cabinet will take the reins to reestablish America's fractured relationships with our closest allies. So the larger question is, how does disinformation and misinformation of this nature take such a strong grip on the minds of some segments of the population? It really is a troubling question, a phenomenon that we're dealing right now. The problem is not unique to America. If we cannot, as a society, agree on fundamental facts and straightforward interpretation of the facts, then we will not be able to hold honest deliberation and debate about pressing and serious policy matters. So I was gratified to learn of Sir David's new book, How Spies Think, because this problem is really about how people acquire knowledge and how they come to think about how the world works. So I served for 8 years on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. I'm highly appreciative, therefore, not only of intelligence gathering processes, but also the critical role of thoughtful and wise analysis. So as Sir David can explain better than I, intelligence agencies are well aware of human cognitive biases and therefore develop formal methods and processes for maintaining multiple hypotheses and for correctly integrating uncertain evidence. So the job of an intelligence analyst is to connect the dots, quite simply, right? When the dots are sparse and fuzzy, many different narrative stories can seem to make sense, depending on what one already believes. So that's why intelligence professionals know that they really must take extra care before drawing firm conclusions. We cannot expect the average citizen, of course, to master the formal methods of trained intelligence experts. That human weaknesses for a convenient story has been exploited since the dawn of time. And we always have had conspiracy theories of one form or another. But the age certainly of targeted advertising and democratized social media has, however, created new vulnerabilities in our capacity for rational collective thought. And the current environment invites malign influence operations by foreign actors designed to drive wedges and cleave us apart along legitimate and manufactured political differences. And this is, again, troubling. The challenge before us is one of balance. So how can we maintain free and open exchanges of information and encourage freedom of thought and expression while at the same time shaping the information landscape in the direction of measured, sensible consideration of evidence and rational thought, more in the manner practiced by intelligence professionals? So this remains a problem that we are all struggling with. My cause, though, for optimism is that increasingly the problem of polarization and the shape of the information landscape is being acknowledged. And leaders such as yourselves certainly recognize that we need to find solutions that fit the values of our society. So obviously, we don't yet have viable solutions as of yet. This is a central struggle before us, and one that we're going to need to continue to work on in the coming years. It does deserve adequate attention and focus. But these are things that we work on together. In conclusion, let me just say I want to thank you for your attention to the themes that I've raised in my remarks today. The underlying theme among them, of course, is balance. And we need to design a balance into our organizational structures for addressing cybersecurity concerns that cut across multiple agencies and government. We believe we can achieve this in the United States, in part by positioning a national cyber director in the White House. We need to design balance in the interdependence of our economies, notably in the case of information and telecommunications equipment. We need to make sure supply chains are diversified, and we can achieve, I believe, this by developing open standards that support interoperability. So, and of course, in the governance of our information environment for public discourse, we really must find a balance in whatever safeguards we design to defend against misinformation, disinformation, and influence operations. I trust that as we go forward, we will strengthen our common cause in securing the future for our countries, for our civilization. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. And I certainly look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's go straight on then to James Brokenshire. James?
David, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting today together with Cityforum and Wilton Park. I think really interesting, useful, positive event that we've got to be able to, I hope, generate some real discussion around some of the themes that you've highlighted there. And James has set that up so well with, I think, the very thoughtful context that he's given. And I would certainly add that sense of partnership to his list that he set out of the themes to be considered, because it is about how we work collectively together across government, with industry, and indeed internationally as well, advancing some of those like-minded themes that James highlighted. Certainly the cyber threats we face continue to grow in scale and sophistication. And as a result, we see threats presenting themselves both in terms of criminal and state actor type perpetration. It's why in this country, cyber is a tier 1 national security threat. I think it's also against the background that the COVID-19 pandemic has also changed how we go about our daily lives and also altered the nature of, yes, the positive opportunities, but also the challenges that we face too. We are spending more time at home, and citizens and businesses are more reliant on the internet for managing day-to-day life and work, with many organizations seeing more employees working from home and depending on online services for essentials like food, shopping, and banking. Today's technology has certainly helped us keep connected and maintain contact with work, friends, and family. However, it is a sad reality that scammers, fraudsters, and hackers will seek to exploit any opportunity to steal money or data from businesses and individuals. And yes, there are states who have moved swiftly to exploit the chance presented to gain access to sensitive and valuable digital assets. In the case of ransomware in particular, we're seeing criminals taking a more targeted approach and focusing on companies and organizations and taking the time to research their targets to maximize their chances of realizing higher sums of money through their extortion. It's critical to our safety, security, and prosperity that our citizens and businesses can operate safely and securely online. While the pandemic has undoubtedly brought increased awareness of these threats, improving the UK's cybersecurity remains a priority for the government. The current 5-year National Cybersecurity Strategy, backed by £1.9 billion of investment, was launched in 2016. It's a strategy that's brought together the best from government and industry to strengthen our defences and improve our resilience. Central to this effort is our world-leading National Cybersecurity Centre, launched in October 2016, which provides a single central body for cybersecurity at a national level. It manages national security incidents and can carry out real-time threat analysis and provide tailored sectoral advice. Now, we know that businesses need the right support to protect themselves. The NCSC also provides high-quality security advice to ensure all UK businesses, from sole traders to large global organisations and critical national infrastructure, are able to protect themselves. All advice and information they provide is informed directly by the very latest information they're privy to on the current cyber threat. Now, alongside the NCSC, the National Crime Agency has been making an important contribution in the fight against cybercrime. We've been working closely with law enforcement partners to develop an effective, coordinated response at local, regional, and national levels. At a local level, we funded dedicated cybercrime units in each of England's 43 police forces to ensure that all local businesses can access advice and support on how to guard themselves online. These units, which stood up in April of last year, have already significantly increased the number of arrests for Computer Misuse Act offences in the UK, helping to protect people and businesses against the dangers in cyberspace. The units are coordinated at a regional level by our regional cybercrime units in each of our regional organised crime units, again, drawing the different strands together and operating against our thematics, our elements of our organised crime strategy of pursue, prevent, protect, and prepare. We've now rolled out more than half of the regional cyber resilience centres planned, which pool the expertise available in each region from across academia, business, and policing, whilst boosting the pipeline of experienced cyber-skilled talent by providing affordable help with cyber protection, recovery, and resilience, bringing to small and medium-sized enterprises that knowledge. But we've been challenging ourselves further as to what capabilities are needed and required to meet the threats and challenges that are faced. Last month, we announced the new National Cyber Force, a collaborative effort between the Ministry of Defence, GCHQ, and SIS, which will extend the reach of our cyber capabilities even further to provide stronger protection, greater resilience, and to combat the growing threats we face. The NCF will deliver cyber operations to support the UK's national security priorities as a responsible world-leading cyber power, from supporting military operations to countering serious crime and combating terrorism. The UK is committed to using its cyber capabilities with clear accountability and in line with UK and international law. The UK continues to work actively with the international community to implement the voluntary and non-binding norms of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace and deepen understanding on how international law applies. We are committed to making the UK the safest place to live and work online. But that collective mission extends beyond government and law enforcement. Every single person can and must play a role by remaining alert and taking proportionate steps to protect themselves. And one of the challenges attached to improving cybersecurity for individuals and businesses is that cybersecurity is not always designed in to how we engage with the internet. There are, of course, some simple steps that everyone can take. We all know that strong passwords and good cyber hygiene are the basic measures needed to protect against cyber attack. And we work to bring that advice to the widest possible audience, in particular through our Cyber Aware campaign, launched in April, which encourages small businesses and individuals to adopt more secure online behaviors, like, yes, using a strong separate password for your email and installing the latest software and app updates. However, even with a strong cyber hygiene, a data breach or attack against a friend or colleague remains possible and could still make us vulnerable to attacks. It's therefore vital that we in government continue to work closely with the private sector on cybersecurity and focus on designing in greater cybersecurity for end users. There are many organizations doing great work in this area who have good connections with their customers or audiences who they support. The key then is in providing consistency so that wherever people turn to, they receive the same well-informed advice rather than varying advice, which risks confusing the message. We have done and continue to do huge amounts to tackle this threat, but we must always bear in mind that the threat is constantly changing, constantly evolving, and that we have to be able to take action when we need to in order to continue to keep pace with and address cyber threats and protect the UK and its citizens. In that regard, we are now working to develop the next national cybersecurity strategy, which will build on existing successes and on the experience we've gained to continue to drive and support cybersecurity in the UK and into the future. That's why I think today's discussion is so helpful in terms of informing those next steps, gaining that discussion, ensuring that we are prioritizing the most important aspects of this. Because the threat is real, we know that, the challenges are there too, but it will only be by that collective endeavor of government working with academia, with industry, and indeed with shared partners internationally who have those same shared values that we will combat that threat. But I'm confident that we can do so. And in terms of approaching this next step, it is very firmly building on, I think, solid foundations that have been created. But we know that we need to continue to challenge ourselves. That is why today is so informative and why I welcome being part of the event that has been organised and certainly the discussion that I'm sure will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Dominic. You're muted at the moment.
As not to interrupt. Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure to be able to participate in this webinar. And I'm very conscious that, having listened carefully to what James Brokenshire particularly had to say, there's an awful lot that I might say which would simply repeat what he said. And so I think the best contribution I can make is to focus a little bit on the experience I had from my time as chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee and the work that we did in this area. And of course, in two areas particularly. One was in respect of the Russia report, which we brought out and which had a major cyber component to it. And the second one in relation to China, which was never completed, but we certainly published a section about Huawei's involvement in 5G technology. Just to start with a few basic thoughts. I certainly take the view, and I share what James has said, that I think that the United Kingdom has been and remains an absolute leading light in trying to deal with cyber threats. And it's one of the pleasures, actually, of having been chair of an Intelligence and Security Committee, scrutinising the work of a government that is a leading global player in this respect. And there's no doubt in my mind as well that the opening of the National Cybersecurity Centre, even if my committee had some criticisms about the procurement process, is something very greatly to be welcomed, because I have absolutely no doubt that it has positioned itself at the cutting edge between the work that used to be done at GCHQ and elsewhere within the agencies and a public-facing role, which is enabling us to deliver, I think, much better levels of protection, particularly within critical national infrastructure, but even beyond that, generally in providing that advice which James has highlighted so clearly is needed, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, and indeed for individuals as to how to maintain their own security on the internet. What then are those areas where I think there are continuing challenges? Well, first, as we highlighted in the Russia report, we simply have to face up to the fact that there are a number of state actors, and Russia is one of them, but I think we have to recognize that there are at least 3 or 4 others, China, North Korea, and Iran, who are serious rogues when it comes to activities within the internet. And countering those activities raises a number of really complex, both practical and ethical issues. In our report on Russia, we highlighted the extent of Russia's malicious cyber activity in order to insert itself aggressively in a number of spheres, including, and I'll come back to this in a moment, the attempt to influence democratic elections in certain countries. The fact that it undertakes pre-positioning activity, which looks as if it's either a prelude to espionage or alternatively, in fact, a prelude to eventual sabotage if it considers that it's justified. And that linked to Russia's rogue status, quite frankly, as an international actor in a number of spheres, particularly in relation to subversion, is a very real challenge. How then, both in relation to Russia, but other rogue states, do we counter it? I listened with great interest to what James Brokenshire was saying about a national cyber force. I'm very pleased that one has been set up, and indeed it reflects something which the committee has long argued for. But at the same time, the ground rules under which a national cyber force can operate remain, I think, fairly opaque. And that's not a criticism of the government. I think it's a criticism of the state of international law. The UN has made its point, and we adhere to it, that international law applies to cyberspace. How does international law apply, for example, to taking preemptive action against a state where you believe is about to use cyber means, for example, to commit sabotage to your critical national infrastructure? These are very difficult issues that remain at the moment largely unresolved. The fact that one may be building capacity in order to do these things doesn't mean that actually we have yet found at an international level with our key partners a means of resolving some of these ethical and practical political dilemmas. And I think this is going to be one of the big growth areas that we're going to have to look at. Secondly, the second issue at a United Kingdom level that continues to cause me some concern is the issue of state subversion. We know in the context of the US presidential elections, but in fact there are numerous other examples that Russia, again in particular, has as a state actor been willing to engage in such practices. But there is something of a dilemma as to how one protects one's democratic processes. Because, as was pointed out to me when I was chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee by one of the members of my committee who was a leading light in a minority party, in a discussion we were having with the National Cybersecurity Centre, do you, as a minority party, which collects allegedly the best data on your electorate for the perfectly legitimate electoral uses, and is deeply concerned that this might be compromised by somebody hacking into it from outside and making use of it, want to have the National Cybersecurity Centre crawling over your data? And this, I think, is an issue of trust, which goes quite far, even in a democratic country like the United Kingdom, as to how we best respond to this. as you will be aware, we were critical of the fact that following the Brexit referendum, in effect, we discovered as a committee that the possibilities of subversion had not been fully examined because people had simply moved on, whilst making an assumption that there was no clear evidence that that had happened. I think this is an issue that we can't get away from. The government very properly indicated the last election was evidence of attempted Russian interference. And I think we are going to have to come back to this. And indeed, my recommendation would be that the political parties should meet to discuss this issue. MI5 has a clear remit to protect our democratic processes. And indeed, it's helped in by the other agencies, and particularly GCHQ. And I think that this is an area that has not yet, to my mind, been satisfactorily resolved. National infrastructure. I agree entirely with what James Langevin said, that you cannot have a monopoly provider to your national critical infrastructure. When the Huawei controversy was running around in the United Kingdom, my committee produced a report pointing out that we were satisfied, having discussed it with GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Centre, that the UK actually had the means, preventative means, to prevent Huawei's role in 5G from leading to the compromise of our systems. But that, as we also pointed out, was a very different thing from giving Huawei a monopoly position within the provision of that system itself. And I have to say, I greatly welcomed the government's decision when it eventually came to adopt both Australia and the United States approach, which was that the links which Huawei has to the Chinese government are sufficiently clear to make it an unreliable partner for the delivery of such a system. But then that, of course, calls into question how we within the West are going to develop our own technological know-how to deliver this. It's worth bearing in mind that some of the Western suppliers also have their parts manufactured in China. So that dependency is, I think, going to be a key issue for the future. Next in my list, I think, is the issue of low-level cyber fraud. I was very, very pleased to hear from James Brokenshire about the development of the dedicated local cyber units. Because my own experience, and I think that when we were on the committee, was that this was a neglected area. When I was Attorney General, I used to be responsible for action fraud, which was a small unit which was transferred to the National Crime Agency. But it came in for a great deal of criticism that although it was capable of collating material and evidence and handing it on of where crime was taking place, most of which was linked to cyber activities of one form or another and Computer Misuse Act offences. Nevertheless, the truth was there was very little being done about it. And I think that if there's any area that needs public reassurance in this country, it is that these issues are being taken seriously. Most of my constituents, who were victims of internet fraud, there was a cyber element to it, whether it was stealing their passwords, hacking into their systems, redirecting money which should have been paid to them to somebody else. And this was happening on a very extensive scale. We need to be in a position to provide reassurance in this field. And I think that that may well be an area where, different from critical national infrastructure, inevitable, therefore, it should be given a lower priority. But nevertheless, there needs to be much higher levels of public reassurance. Those were the key points which I wanted to cover in this presentation from the point of view of my own experience on the committee. As I say in conclusion, I think the UK has been really at the leading edge of this, and I've enjoyed, certainly when I was chair of the committee, also going over to the United States and seeing the partnership that we had built up. But it's a very complex landscape, and we are going to need, I think, to put greater emphasis on it if we're going to stay ahead of those who wish to misuse the systems. And one issue that we just gently touched on is the extraordinary way in which a number of rogue state actors are in fact teamed up with criminal gangs in order to exploit the systems, raising an even more complex issue as to how we as a state might respond to that when it's clear that the links exist. But if we do it properly, then I'm actually fairly optimistic that things are better today than they were 3, 4 or 5 years ago. And that is actually a great credit to, in the United Kingdom context, to a real government emphasis on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Kiersten, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. Thank you, David, James, Representative Langevin, Dominic, and Adam. It's great to be a part of a conversation with each of you. I do want to take the moment to just commend the work of Representative Langevin as a United States citizen for what he's done in leadership for cybersecurity, and certainly most recently on the Solarium Commission. To give you a little bit of context on the position from where I stand, I served in the United States Senate and worked as a staffer and worked on the legislation to create the Department of Homeland Security. I served as executive director of President Obama's independent commission on enhancing national cybersecurity, and then started a nonprofit with some of the commissioners to address the issue of small business cybersecurity by providing free tools, and doing that by focusing on human behavior. I think we've had a tremendous discussion already of some of the highlights of the issues around cybersecurity and the strengths and the challenges from both the United States and the UK. A common theme that we've discussed in this conversation has been interdependencies. And so I would like to play off of that theme by looking at how the UK and the United States can work more effectively together as we look into the future. Certainly from the United States perspective, a transition to a new administration always provides an opportunity, not necessarily for a reset, but for a step back and an assessment of where we are and what we need to do. And again, Congressman Langevin did a tremendous job, as always, of identifying this range of issues that we're dealing with. And I want to start by talking about what has worked well in the US-UK relationship when it comes to cybersecurity. And you've heard some of this already, but I think certainly the relationship between CISA, the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, with the NCSC, Kieran Martin and his team. When we look at this, both agencies are relatively new, which I think is also an important point, because they didn't carry with them any baggage historically, which I think with cybersecurity can sometimes impede innovation. But the NCSC being launched in 2016, CISA being launched in 2018, and the collaboration on the civilian side of how to protect critical infrastructure, I think is certainly an achievement that both nations should be proud of, and one upon which should be built into the future. Representative Langevin talked about organization around cybersecurity, and I certainly will be sending positive energy to the NDAA in the hopeful passage of that position of the National Cybersecurity Director within the US government. It's something that the Obama Commission was certainly in support of, and hopefully this happens. But I would also look from the United States perspective at empowering CISA even more, because the protection of critical infrastructure has become more important as our interdependencies have proliferated. We used to have critical infrastructure in silos because it maintained itself within its own infrastructure. The interdependencies of the global digital economy mean that infrastructure across infrastructures are connected, as well as those entities and businesses that may not even be deemed to be critical infrastructure. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So building off of the successes of the CISA-NCSC relationship, I think is critical to the future of cybersecurity, not just for these two nations, but I believe it provides a foundation for collaboration globally. The other piece is the work of US Cyber Command on its Defend Forward Persistent Engagement strategy. And part of that strategy was a hunt forward mission to look for malware on networks of the United States allies and partners, and to go to the source of the malicious activity. This effort was effective because of the relationship globally that the United States has. And I think working with its partners more collaboratively, working with like-minded nations, but specifically with the UK, we can work off of this effective strategy as we look at active defense and moving forward. So we can see the successes that this relationship, the US-UK relationship, can build off of, but it's important to look at the challenges as well, and where we need further development and where we need further action. And again, some of these are going to be familiar themes, but they're certainly worth repeating. The United States absolutely has to revisit its international cooperation. We have fallen short over the last 4 years in our ability to work with our allies and to work collaboratively. And certainly the US-UK relationship is an important place to start and to build off of. Also, and we've heard this now, I think from each speaker, Securing our global digital infrastructure is a priority, not just for the United States, not just for the UK, but around the world. It is really about a race between two visions and a race between two sets of values. It's not about who has the cheapest technology, but what is the most effective way to build out this secure infrastructure. And we have to work with emerging countries to help them and support them to have the infrastructure that will serve their values and their approaches most effectively. Another key priority that we absolutely need to be focusing on is supply chain security. As I mentioned, and as we've heard all morning or afternoon, the interdependencies of our infrastructure as well as our digital economy mean that we don't have clear visions or clear lines on where infrastructure ends. The lines around what is critical have become blurred. And when we see issues like ransomware affecting global value chains, we understand the importance of securing supply chains. As I mentioned, I currently serve as Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute, which is focused on small business cybersecurity. We have a partner with this institute that is a global manufacturing company that over the course of the pandemic has had serious disruption to its value chain because the small businesses in its value chain have been affected and in some cases completely taken down by ransomware. When we look at the recent stories even within the last 24 hours, certainly in the case of the UK, and it'll be a future story as we continue to evolve in the US around vaccine distribution, we have to recognize that supply chain vulnerabilities are critical and should be a priority to securing. And we've got to look at the issues that surround that, which is how do we provide the resources to these businesses that are parts of these global supply chains? That we recognize that it can be just one functionality of a business, but it can be critical to how a vaccine is distributed, to how we deliver a certain function. Other challenges that we have to do better at, that we have to improve, certainly from the United States side, but I would assert that this is a global cybersecurity challenge, is IP theft. We've talked about disinformation, looking at misinformation, and how we work collaboratively to do this. So if we assess the recommendations for how this US-UK relationship can build, one recommendation that I certainly have as we look at the transition to the Biden administration is for there to be an assessment, a collaborative threat assessment of the state of cybersecurity. What are the priorities for the United States and the United Kingdom? And how can we work together to achieve the goals for those priorities more effectively? We heard a little bit about human behavior and creating a repository of information. I certainly think this is an aligned effort between the two countries, and we need to do better on providing a centrally located set of recommendations and tools for our businesses. We need to have a collaborative approach to Chinese technology. I think this is certainly a priority for both nations, and we can come together to look at this. Are there opportunities for joint R&D to address these issues? I would assert that social media has become part of our nation's, the United States, critical infrastructure. I would be interested in exploring this topic with the UK. Can we do a better job of managing how social media and technology is becoming part of our critical infrastructure and bringing those companies to the table? In the United States, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube had an enormous impact on our election security, ultimately because these companies decided to pivot in an appropriate direction for democracy, but that happened without any government oversight. So we've got to look more effectively at this and to ensure the US-UK efforts are enforcing and reinforcing and not duplicative or conflict in any way. Part of this involves pre-event planning between the two countries. The best time to determine an approach for policies is in peacetime. So we need this well-calibrated, balanced approach to addressing cybersecurity by this alignment of efforts and the prioritization of these efforts globally. As we look to figure out and understand where we can collaborate, we, the United States, know that we cannot address cybersecurity effectively as one nation. We address it through collaboration. And given the extensive partnership between the United States and the United Kingdom, even during times of fluctuating leadership, we have an opportunity right now to work off of the successes of our relationship in the past and to build a strategy and a set of solutions for the cybersecurity challenges that are confronting not just each of our nations independently, but our global economy and the nations worldwide. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to present to you, and I certainly look forward to the discussion that's coming.
Thank you very much, Kiersten. I've certainly made a note of collaborative threat assessment. It's rather a good idea. Adam, would you like to round us off?
Thanks, David, and thank you to Cityforum Wilton Park for inviting me to speak today. I'm Adam from the Online Harms Foundation. We're a small not-for-profit based in the UK, and we implement a public-private partnership called Tech Against Terrorism. We work with the UN, Five Eyes governments, and the tech industry to help them tackle the terrorist use of the internet whilst respecting human rights. And in practice, what we do is we help the tech sector forensically understand how terrorists use their services. We then provide free advice and consultancy services to the tech sector and build tools and data sets to support improved content moderation. So the first half of my response is based on what do governments need to know in our view. So my first point here is that information technology, the internet, is a disruptive tool, obviously both for commerce and society. And when we think of disruption, we typically point to the Ubers of the world or WeWorks. But in reality, the revolutionary impact of the internet is much broader than this. It also focuses on how society, and in particular how democratic society functions. It clearly influences how we perceive the world, what information we consider credible, and how we make decisions in a well-functioning society. So the internet presents a pretty broad set of challenges, unlike any other form of media revolution before, disrupting common sense notions of the nation state, its responsibilities, and the division of responsibility between the state and the private sector, in particular big tech. In many ways also, the internet and content regulation, as is becoming more important, is disrupting the notion of regulation itself. And finally with this, it's important to stress that the internet is not just about big tech. We hear about the Googles and Facebooks of the world, but in reality, where terrorists are concerned, the majority of their use of the internet is on the smallest platforms. It's those smallest platforms often have the least capability to counter the threat and to work through some of the difficulties that they have. The second point that I'd like to make is that the internet and information technology in general exposes and widens existing fault lines in society. It's important that we focus on the causes of behavior online, because the internet quite obviously reflects the views of real people in society. And we shouldn't forget this. If a citizen is posting content online, then we have to think through why they're doing so. What is the legality of them thinking this, regardless of whether they do so on the internet? And in that sense, the internet exposes inequality and grievance and vulnerability in society, unlike any time before. And this, in a way, puts democracies on the back foot in a relatively weak position, because, of course, unlike any other time in the history of humanity, we pretty much can know what everyone's thinking, but there's no real way to influence that other than addressing root causes, which is, of course, extremely difficult to do. So when thinking about content regulation and use of the internet, it's important, therefore, to focus on the causes in society, not just on the effect of seeing user-generated content online. Thirdly, the risk of unintended consequences here is severe in our view. We have to protect, uphold, and strengthen the core values that we have in democracies. We can't, well, we must not allow ourselves to resemble our adversaries, whether they're terrorists or state actors. So how do we ensure that the ground rules are created in a way that supports the rule of law rather than undermines it? What is the risk of making activity online illegal when actually offline it's not illegal? What does that mean in terms of jurisprudence? And when can content moderation become part of the problem? Do we just delete content that we don't like, or do we have the courage of conviction to challenge it and to encourage open debate in society? Certainly, terrorists and violent extremists have a long history of exploiting new media, whether that be newspapers and the Bolshevik Revolution, or Al-Qaeda and broadcast TV. Terrorists and violent extremists are pretty entrepreneurial in that sense, and they'll always be trying to exploit new technologies, and the internet is no different. But let's not forget the IRA and even Al-Qaeda existed way before the internet. Crucially, unless we focus on the cause, we believe at Tech Against Terrorism, all we will see is shifting behavior, the so-called adversarial shift. In the heyday of ISIS use of social media in 2015, there was a real problem with them using Facebook and Google and Twitter. But over the past few years, much of this activity has just migrated to smaller platforms where it's much more difficult to understand and intervene. So there is another risk of whack-a-mole unless we focus on the causes. In particular, we're worried about decentralized technology. At the moment, most of the websites or apps that we think about are centralized in nature. It's possible to moderate content on these, but in the future, decentralized technologies, peer-to-peer messaging systems will become much more popular. Many of these will be impossible to content moderate because of the blockchain supporting them, for example. So what do we do there? What happens if we push activity onto technologies that are impossible to moderate or monitor? And also, how do we deal with very real issues of, for example, terrorist-operated websites? Terrorists exploit gaps between technology companies and governments. But actually today, a terrorist organization can very easily create their own website, an ISIS.org, and it's really not clear who is responsible for dealing with this. It is not clear who should take that down. Is it ICANN? Is it domain name registrar? Is it a host? Is it a government? Nobody really knows. And as a consequence, even though the tech sector is doing more to counter terrorist use of their services, terrorists increasingly find it pretty easy to create their own websites, which seems rather perverse to me. So in terms of recommendations for action, then 2 points here. First, can we encourage a more holistic systems-based approach to responding to the threat of harmful content online? We have to recognize that this is a wicked problem. Meaning that defined by a design theorist in the 1930s. Wicked problems, of course, having 10 characteristics, for example, it being very hard to determine when the problem is solved, or when a wicked problem is a symptom of other problems, or when policymakers are liable for the consequences of the solutions they generate. So the terrorist use of the internet, in our view, is a wicked problem and requires a different response. Public-private partnerships, we'd suggest, as one of them, is one potential response to this, but public-private partnerships are extremely hard to make work. Also, how do we focus on the broader set of online harms, not just terrorist content, but other concerns that smaller platforms have? And finally, in terms of what we would like to see from government more is more strategic leadership. Dominic was mentioning the unclear ground rules in terms of internet governance, and he couldn't be more right. What existing political mechanisms exist? Designation lists of terrorist organizations. Why is it that so few violent far-right organizations are designated? The UK leads the way in this regard, but very few other governments have formally designated far-right organizations, which means that there's very little legal grounds for some tech companies to remove content created by extreme far-right organizations. Can we not focus on that? Can we not reform the designations process? Also, protocols. Is there an opportunity to develop protocols and open standards around open source intelligence, such as STIX 2.1 used for cybersecurity events? Could something similar be developed for content? Thirdly, what about economics and regulation? Here, there's market failure where content moderation is concerned. Those smallest platforms have the greatest need, but the least capability. How can they develop best-in-class systems to moderate content if they've got no revenue or profit? And the final point I will say is that smaller platforms here are essential, but often forgotten about. So how can we ensure with improved regulation that smaller platforms are given the support they need, whilst also ensuring the bigger tech platforms are more responsible? So on that, thank you. I'll hand back over to David.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. Whilst we've got the two Jameses with us, I wonder if I might start us off by posing a question which has already come up in what we've heard. One of the Solarium Commission's recommendations was that the Director of National Intelligence should establish and fund a social media data and threat analysis centre to encourage public-private cooperation to detect and counter foreign influence operations. And I wonder if James would like to say a word about what's the thinking here? Because should the United Kingdom have one too? We have, in a sense, the president of the UK Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which has been a great success. It works with the United States National Counterterrorism Centre. They work very closely together. If we had centres that were looking at what is going on in social media and analyzing that, not from the purely cybersecurity sense, but actually looking at the policy implications too of what is going on social media. Would that put us in a better position to tackle these potential harms? Because certainly in the British case, a number of government departments, including culture, media and sport, have an interest, and the Home Office an interest, and the agencies have interests. But James Langevin, do you want to just say a word about why the Commission came up saying you actually need a threat analysis center for social media?
Yeah, so right now, social media and its rise and how it's proliferated has really challenged us. Most people get their news, for example, from social media, and it is a mechanism for, obviously, for discourse among the American people, and certainly a way for politicians to communicate with their constituents, and constituents directly with their politicians. But it's also been used by our enemies and adversaries to divide us. And it's one thing if the American people are speaking with each other and having disagreements. Another thing if foreign powers are using it as part of an influence operation, an intelligence operation, to sow discord and sow division. And so we think it's important to understand, what is how social media is being used, and by working together, having more transparency and calling out inaccurate information or information is being used by foreign intelligence operations or agencies for division, we think would be helpful in undercutting the success that our enemies have had in using those tools to divide us.
Thank you. James Brokenshire, is this something you could look at in the 2021 revision of your strategy?
Well, obviously, we are looking at the cyber security strategy and how to respond to changing threats. But what I suppose I would say is, as you've highlighted, David, there is work across government on disinformation and misinformation that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport leads, but that draws in a number of the interests of different departments, and therefore to coalesce and respond to where there may be that misinformation, strengthening the work of the Cabinet Office on its own programme in relation to defending our democracy. So I certainly want to give that clear sense of purpose that we have. I'd also pivot this across to the responsibility of the companies themselves. We will be shortly publishing the response to the online harms white paper, and that sense of a duty of care with a regulator that sits alongside that sort of social norming and the responsibility that industry itself also has. And then, of course, the high-end threats where the National Cybersecurity Centre and our intelligence agencies bring together, and obviously vigilant as to the challenges, and indeed, as you've already referenced, calling that out where they see behavior that is intended to influence. So I think there are a number of different factors and a number of different pieces of work here, and how that sits under the architecture of the National Security Council. But of course, we will continue to challenge ourselves as we look to the next part of the strategy in ensuring that we are very conscious of the sorts of threats and challenges. And indeed, I think the very instructive work that the cyberspace Solarium recommendations highlighted, and very much appreciate the work that James and others were involved in there, and how some of that sort of social norming, that, and equally the I suppose the legislative and underpinning of all of this, which is where things that I've championed over the years on the Budapest Convention in relation to things like criminality also very firmly come into play. So I think there's a lot that we could unpack on its own in that one question, but it is an area that we will very much continue to focus on.
Oh, thank you, James. Dominic, you comfortable with that from your previous position, or would you be pressing for more focus,
I think
responsibility in the centre?
I think I would be pressing for a bit more focus. I think there's been a tendency to skate round this. As I came back to my issue about trust, that these are sensitive issues because they bring into play a multiplicity of matters: freedom of expression, the role of service providers, and the fact that they have increasingly, well, it's now reversed, but in the early stages of their existence, they were hands-off organizations that said, we provide the service and we don't have any responsibility for what's on it. And the wider issue of the rather more difficult one, I suppose, what constitutes truth? We know, however, that this is a medium which is ripe and open to exploitation. And it is, in a sense, a Wild West. It has very little control over it. So I think there is a need in mature democracies to have a national conversation on a cross-party basis about what are the legitimate limits that can be placed, and then to seek by international cooperation to see that they can actually be enforced. I'm partly reassured by what James has said, but I think we could go further than we have. And I think that otherwise the risk is that this is just going to continue to grow. The point was made earlier. The difficulty is that once you start to control one area of this, it simply shifts onto another, and often usually onto another area which is even harder to control because it may be encrypted. So these are complex issues, and I do actually think that ultimately we do have a right as democracies to a certain degree of self-assertion collectively in trying to exercise some control over it. And I don't yet think we've really had that conversation.
Excuse me, David, if I could
James.
interrupt. I do apologize. I have to take my leave and head off to the Hill to the Bill today. But thank you for including me, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to participate in future forum like this. It's very insightful, and I really enjoyed the presentations of all of my fellow panelists. So thank you for your work and your perspectives.
Thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to a 2021 that is rather more purposeful in this area. Absolutely,
and I know I made the comment earlier before the presentation went live, but I'm a big fan of what Great Britain has been able to accomplish with NCSC, and Kieran Martin has been to my office many times in Washington, and applaud the work that he did in setting up NCSC and the work that continues there, and now that his successor has taken over. And I look forward to continued collaboration. I hope we have a lot to learn, I think, from Great Britain. I'm very envious of the collaborative relationship between the government and private sector critical infrastructure and the ISPs. That's something that I hope that we'll be able to get to modeling more closely here in the United States in the future as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
James, do you have do you have a minute or two, or are you?
There's probably one more question, if I might, David. Unfortunately, the clock is pressing and other people are hovering.
Very good. Okay. Well, can I just pick up one of the questions, which is really about the Computer Misuse Act?
Yes.
And whether actually it is inhibiting certain forms of cyber protection, cyber defense, by making it quite difficult for the cybersecurity companies to operate. I think you know the issue.
Yeah, and I know that this is this is a complex area of law. Now, I think the Computer Misuse Act undergoes periodic review, and I am certainly very open to listen to ways in which we can improve this, because it's about having, yes, capability in that sense of the sorts of units, the sorts of technical capability that you put in place, but it's also the legal construct and the tools that you have to support the executive action and ensuring that that remains up to date and effective in a changing and evolving world, and also in terms of supporting positive action and enabling you to take the enforcement against the negative action. I think that what I would say in this space is, because of some of the complexity, it's important that when we consider any change, we don't inadvertently, in trying to do the positive thing, create loopholes that criminals could then seek to exploit. And so I do absolutely hear the point that is being made, and I'm receptive to the different arguments. I think my only caution is that we do this in a thoughtful way, which then doesn't create further problems that we hadn't quite anticipated. So I'm certainly sympathetic to the point of view, and I can see Dominic laughing here as the former Attorney General, but it isn't straightforward, but nonetheless, it's one that we do need to engage with.
Dominic, you're dying to say something.
Sorry, make sure I'm...
you're fine.
Yes, I mean, James is absolutely right. It's a bit of a sort of can of worms, and there is a law of unintended consequences in all this, but that should not, I think, prevent us from having this conversation.
Yeah,
and I'm just not sure up to now that we've just shied off having it at all. And I don't think there's any harm in holding it, because we might just start to find some solutions. That's my point.
Good. Well, thank you for that. James, we better let you go.
Good. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of today's discussion. And very much, I know other members of my team are still here to be able to respond, and equally to listen to the continuing debate. But it is one that I'm sure that we will have. And as we look to the next stages of the strategy, one that we're keen to encourage too. But thank you so much for the invitation today.
Thank you, James. And welcome to Virginia Eyre, who's Deputy Director Cyber Policy in the Cyber Policy Unit in the Serious and Organised Crime Group in the Home Office, who is now online, as it were, and can pick up where James would have picked up policy issues in this area. Shall we move on to a different area? A number of questions, and thank you, John Child, for raising the Computer Misuse Act.
Yeah.
A number of questioners have raised the question of supply chains and supply chain security. And so two issues have been raised in the questions. One is the balance in American terms between what's done at state and at federal level, but in UK terms, it would be the balance between regulation and simply guidance. So how far do we involve the regulators of, for example, the electricity power industry, and actually say, not only is it safety and security and continuity of supply, but there are other specific counter sabotage or counter infiltration requirements which regulators place as law on the industry. So there's some quite interesting issues around the challenge of supply chain security. Kiersten, is this something you've looked at and from your point of view?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in different contexts. So as I mentioned, the commission that I worked on with President Obama, we started looking at supply chain security, specifically because the interdependencies of critical infrastructure were starting to increase, that what is critical is connected to that which is not critical because of our digital infrastructure. And as I mentioned, the work I've been doing right now with small business cybersecurity is really highlighting the challenges of supply chain security. We have to remember that it truly is about exposing the weakest link. And we're starting to see some examples of how the vaccine distribution supply chains have vulnerabilities that can be compromised. And so in the United States, certainly in looking at the Biden administration, supply chain security has to be enforced. We had a rule come out by our Department of Treasury that talked about the penalties that would be imposed on businesses that paid ransom, particularly to foreign states that were on a sanctions list. And so if we talk about those types of penalties, but we don't provide the tools to help those businesses know how to prepare for ransomware, to use this as an example, and how to address it and respond effectively, we can't just get to the penalty. Now, I believe very strongly in a stronger law enforcement structure for cybersecurity. Just because we don't see physical harm by the malicious actor, I would certainly assert that a ransomware attack on a hospital causes physical harm and should have appropriate penalties and issues. But when we look at small businesses and we look at supply chain security, we have to do a better job at the source. And so whether that, and I think this was talked about by James Brokenshire, that the ability to create a repository of resources and tools and information, but an ecosystem of information and education to help with this evolving threat. Because I do worry very much that one of the dominant threats as we look to 2021 is going to be supply chain vulnerability. I cited the manufacturing company that we're working with in the Cyber Readiness Institute that has billions of dollars in its supply chain, and yet it is impeded by small businesses that can't handle ransomware. And so that disparity shows and illustrates that we have a challenge, that the large companies may have all the tools, but if we're not being able to share that information and work with the small businesses who may not have the resources, we are still compromising ourselves. It's the weakest link metaphor. And so as we look in the United States, I think we've got to do a better job at the agency level with our infrastructure to work within the sectors, but we also have to look importantly across sectors. Again, the interdependencies mean that we can't just solve these problems by sector, that we have to understand how the sectors are related and have more efforts across sectors. And just one note, a year and a half ago, the National Risk Management Center was established within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And this is very much premised on the value of cross-sector collaboration. And I think when we look at supply chain security, that will be a critical piece in a solution set.
Thank you. Dominic, what does your instinct tell you about how far one should place burden on through the regulatory mechanism? It seems to me that if down the supply chain, say of the electricity industry, there are systems which are not being supported any longer by the manufacturer, the patches have not been applied, backups were not sufficient, so critical information is actually locked up and is not accessible because it wasn't properly backed up independently. These are failings, are they not?
They are. I think the difficulty is this, and you'll be familiar with this, David, that the UK system for dealing with these threats has evolved from extraordinarily informal relationships. So my impression is that over the years, there's been a build-up of links between government and suppliers of critical national infrastructure, which have been mutually supportive, but have been of largely of an informal nature. And on the whole, my experience when I've been looking at this, and my hat on as chair of the Intelligence Security Committee, is we kept on being assured, well, actually, we're quite pleased with the existing arrangements. We think we have good working relationships. So the regulator's been kept out of it because, of course, the difficulty, as we all know, is that as some of these matters are classified, there's a desire not to widen the circle of people who are brought in to the classified information. And I think that that's one of the reasons, I hazard the suggestion, why it's not been thought, well, why should we bring the regulators in if we've got a good bilateral relationship which we can handle this? But the point you're making is completely legitimate. Why should it not be part of the regulatory framework that the supplier has to meet certain standards and that those are enforced in a much more formalized fashion? Because the public would certainly expect it. And ultimately, people's own domestic security is dependent on it. But this is one of those tensions, isn't it, that's been around for a long time. Just in the same way that it was rather a long time in the United Kingdom to even acknowledge that we had any intelligence agencies at all. Oh. That took rather a long time to emerge. The United States was far ahead of us in that context. And then gradually to accept that, yes, those agencies did have links into critical national infrastructure because it needs to protect them. So it would be, I think, something of a sea change. And what I've always felt coming up against this has been the sense of, well, if we widen this too much, then we're going to start to compromise some of the security, the very security issues that we're trying to address. Now, that's how it's always come across to me. Perhaps I'm mistaken about that. I'm sorry, James has gone because he might have an alternative view. But there's been this slight sense the UK's tended to play its cards very close to its chest. My personal view is there's every reason to think that the regulator should be involved, but then that would presumably require the regulator setting up a secure unit within the regulator's office that could deal with those aspects of the matter.
To which my response would be, well, they ought to have that anyway, because if there is a major incident, then they're all going to be pulled into Victoria Street and the Cyber Security Centre, and the regulators will have to be involved as well as everyone else. Virginia, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from the Home Office perspective.
Oh, no, absolutely. Obviously, can't sort of speak for the Security Minister in terms of his opinion. There are a number of aspects to this. I mean, obviously, it's not as though there is no regulation, because we have the NIS directive. And what I would say is that, and I understand that is only looking at sort of critical national infrastructure, so key sectors. But the cyber assurance framework against which those sort of enterprises are being measured by the competent authorities was devised by NCSC, and obviously NCSC, whilst they might not put that secret intelligence sort of on the table for all to see, it is informing the guidance that they share with everyone. So the best practice and guidance that comes out of NCSC and is made available is being informed by that covert secret picture. So it's not that none of us are benefiting from it, even if we can't sort of see behind the veil, so to speak. There was one other point I thought I'd pick up on, which I think Kiersten was making about also these smaller enterprises and how do we sort of get the benefit to them rather than just focusing on critical national infrastructure and big business. And certainly one of the initiatives that I think we're quite proud of sort of at the Home Office and are working with our law enforcement partners is, and I don't know whether any of you have come across these yet, but we've been developing regional cyber resilience centres. So the aim is ultimately to have a cyber resilience centre in each of sort of 9 regions of the country. And they bring together basically sort of cyber security talent from the universities in that region, the resources that are available to big business are cyber security officers in all that we now have in all the 43 forces, and we sort of by bringing kind of private sector policing and academia together in these regional centres, we're actually making a sort of a quality of cyber security advice and guidance and consultancy available to SMEs that they might not otherwise have benefited from. And the aim is, I think we're about halfway through. I think we're up to about 5 of the 9 that we're aiming for. But I think that, they're quite innovative. They're very new, but I think it will be really interesting to see how they develop. And obviously another kind of byproduct of those centres, as well as the benefits to the SMEs and sort of helping to raise their game on sort of cybersecurity and resilience, is obviously giving sort of hands-on experience to all these students coming out of universities, because one of the things that I'm sure is worrying us all a bit is obviously that pipeline of talent of cyber skilled people that government and private sector are all fighting over them like crazy, because they're all in such high demand. So it's sort of hopefully going to boost the pipeline sort of nationally as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'll come to Adam in a moment, because there's a question that we've got in the webinar. Craig Jones, who's Director of Cybercrime at Interpol, And there's rather an interesting issue he's raising about the role of Interpol. Is it, one might ask, it can't quite be a replacement for the Europol's work, which we've had to withdraw from for Brexit reasons. But could we build more into Interpol as a way, data sharing, resource and investment in their global cybercrime program to reduce the global impact of cybercrime? Virginia, is that something the Home Office is attracted to in your area, looking at serious and organized crime, making more use of Interpol?
So certainly, the FCDO sort of lead this area, but we're working very closely with them on it. I mean, as we all know, cyber crime, cyber threats are borderless. So, it simply isn't a threat that you can address solely on a domestic basis. And as well as obviously all the sort of security cooperation and intelligence sharing that goes on, and the security minister talked about the Budapest Convention, which is obviously really vital to us in that regard. Certainly, we take the view that capacity building internationally is really important as well. I mean, from a law enforcement point of view, you can't really pursue, you can't actor overseas if the state that they're in, if the jurisdiction they're in, hasn't even sort of legislated, has no equivalent of the kind of Computer Misuse Act. They haven't even criminalised the thing for which we want to sort of pursue the perpetrators. So capacity building is a major focus for us. Obviously, with the pandemic, we're going into a very tight fiscal environment. So the FCDO and other colleagues across Whitehall to identify those key sort of strategic areas in the globe where we think we want to prioritise investing in that kind of capacity development. And certainly in terms of Interpol, Interpol have done a lot of work in that space. So do I see them as a potential delivery partner? Absolutely. I can't sign any checks today, as I said, the FCDO lead in this area, but certainly Interpol, I would view them as a potential delivery partner for that kind of capacity building, capability development work globally. Which were Craig able to speak, I'm sure he'd be able to tell us about some of the really good work they've been doing already in that space.
Adam, you've got a view from the international perspective.
Certainly, and where terrorist use of the internet is concerned, the problem here is that terrorism is quite an amorphous issue and means very different things to different governments and sometimes different departments within the same government. And so I mean, our position here, we work very closely with the UN, in particular the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, which sits underneath the UN Security Council. Our view very much is that this is an area where we need to work to strengthen international norms. Is there an opportunity to improve designation of far-right organizations, for example? That would almost certainly make it easier and clearer for tech platforms in their content moderation efforts. And this goes back to the discussion earlier, which is what are the ground rules? And if they're not clear, tech companies cannot operationalize it. If we don't know what we mean by a particular type of content, then no algorithm ever invented will be able to find that content. And I think it's very important as well to kind of understand the limitations of AI and machine learning where content moderation is concerned as well. We've kind of, there's a lot of hype about AI and its capability, but in practice, a lot of these ideas are pretty amorphous. And unless we're clear, as democratic states, there's a real risk here that others, perhaps without those inclinations, will use kind of online harms infrastructure to counter legitimate political speech. And there are many examples of this happening. And what's more, our adversaries do this already. So could we not be falling into a trap where we're actually kind of regulating speech, which is almost not supportive of our own values as a democratic state? And where is the balance to be struck between these two things?
Isn't that, I mean, that must be the key issue. Interpol, for all its good work, and I have no doubt about it, brings together, I think it's 194 states, some of which are certainly not democracies, some of which probably are supportive of terrorism in certain instances, and some of which are almost certainly include state actors which are misusing the internet. So that using that as whilst it would be wonderful to use it as a vehicle for raising standards, I think using it as a vehicle for sharing material or data or information which could be misused, it's impossible. I mean, even Europol has posed some problems, I suspect, from that point of view, even on a much more restricted basis. So I think it's difficult. I find it difficult to see that despite Interpol's undoubted good work, it could be expanded to that level unless you start getting an agreed international framework. And indeed, the UK tried to do that, didn't we? We had a great international conference on cybersecurity, which we held. Well. I can't remember when it was now, 2015, 14? It was a really very big event, but it was quite clear that the parties who were participating had different agendas. Some wanted to talk about controlling the internet for the purposes of their own state. And others wanted to talk about trying to free the internet of rogue elements so that it could be used as a proper means of information and exchange between citizens. These are two very different things.
Good. Well, let me just again from the chat box pick up quite a sensitive issue, but it's already come up, and Dominic, I think you hinted at it. Malcolm War asks the difference between destructive cyber attacks and disruptive cyber attacks. We now have the National Cyber Force, embryonic, but no doubt it will develop. How far is it legitimate to make life difficult for those who intend to harm us? I'm not talking here, and Kieran Martin, who's been name-checked a number of times, recently gave quite a big speech on this, saying this is not about hitting other people's national infrastructure and turning the lights out in Moscow, but this is just about making it quite hard to get material, offensive, illegal material, hate speech, terrorism, propaganda, and so on, into the system, because every time they try and do it, it disappears into some black hole that's been created by manipulating the border gateway protocol or something like that. Let me start with Dominic. Is this ruled out in your former Attorney General's mind? It's still defensive in purpose.
I don't think it is ruled out at all, actually. I think that disruption as opposed to destruction is almost certainly the direction in which offensive cyber, leaving aside circumstances of warfare where destructive cyber may be used, is probably permissible as long as it's necessary and proportionate to a legitimate end. And seeing that there are state actors out there who are using destructive cyber and getting away with it, and it isn't precipitating World War III, I think that using disruptive cyber in circumstances which might give rise to complaint, I think is something that we're almost certainly going to have to accept, although it would be much better if Western democracies establish some sort of common ground rules on which they would then say, well, this is what we will do. And I don't think that is an illegitimate approach. But everybody's a bit sort of like somebody walking around in a darkened room, not 100% sure where they're going or where they're going to end up. We've been building the capacity to do it, as has been pointed out, and the National Cyber Force is clearly intended for that purpose. But how exactly we do it, and do we avow it, or do we do it secretly and just say, well, I'm terribly sorry, it's going to disappear into a black hole, Or are we going to say, well, it's gone into a black hole? And yes, we did it because we took the view that it shouldn't have been there in the first place. These are issues that have not been fully explored. And I think it would be worthwhile trying to do it, because simply ending up in what I would call a sort of secret war, maybe a war is a bit of an exaggeration, but a secret competition and conflict on the fringes may just increase the lawlessness. So I find it a very difficult question to answer how we should best proceed. But again, I think it's something where we need to have that discussion.
David,
Kiersten, yeah, please do it. I'd love to know, is this an area where with the new administration, we could actually see a US-UK attempt to hammer out some norms?
I absolutely think it's an opportunity. And I would agree with Dominic that we need to be looking globally at how we establish these norms. One issue that we looked at the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity was the creation of international norms and standards around some of these broader cyber issues, both in defense and offense. And I mentioned earlier, our US Cyber Command has this Defend Forward Persistent Engagement Strategy, which is going to where these issues are happening at the source. In the United States, federal, state, and local law officials don't have the authority to undertake offensive cyber actions within the US. But if they are seeing where this activity is happening at the source, I talked about the hunt forward efforts, then they can look to disrupt them, as we shared. I think one piece of that then is where the US and UK can create these international norms. I think what Dominic said is exactly right. We've examined the problem a lot. We now have to get to that place of action where we start putting these norms and standards down and come to agreement, knowing it's not going to be perfect. The first draft isn't going to be perfect, but we have to start acting to get us to that next place. The other piece which can't be ignored is that social media, while a tool for technology and all these pieces, has become a real tool of malicious actors. And so we have to look at how these two intersect. And when we talk about global norms and standards, understanding how we're handling this misinformation and disinformation as a component of this strategy, I think is also critical. But again, to Dominic's point, when we look at these, we've got to start acting. Let's start understanding and start creating a framework for action, because we don't need to examine the problem anymore. We need to start looking at where solutions lie, testing them, and then testing them with our partners. And I think this is certainly an opportunity for US-UK collaboration as we look at 2021.
If I may add,
yes, please.
The terrorist use of the internet. So one of my favourite books, actually, counter-terrorism books, is called What Terrorists Want by Louise Richardson, who's currently Vice Chancellor at Oxford. And in that, she focuses on really trying to understand, well, what do terrorists want to achieve and why? And one of our arguments is that, well, terrorists want the renown, they want to build up their reputation, they want recognition, all those classic things that we all understand. And in the sense of what we actually do at Tech Against Terrorism, mainly we focus on identifying precisely which apps, sites terrorists are using, and then try and make things as difficult as possible for them without making the problem worse. So this is about trying to disrupt the channels they're using and whatever it might be to increase the friction of them using the service, but without forcing them to go elsewhere. And in that sense, this represents a sort of virtualization of warfare. In some ways, this is probably better than other ways the terrorists express themselves. That if the battle, if you like, is between the terrorists and others with regards to their freedom of maneuver on the internet, you could argue that this is better than them actually killing people. So it's a sort of virtualization of warfare in the cyber realm is quite interesting. And the second element here is about the point I was making about adversarial shift. For the large part, terrorist activities move from the larger platforms, and they've done that a while back. They're actually on the smaller ones. Most of these smaller ones are improving their capability. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this activity is going to go elsewhere. Terrorists and violent extremists are going to start building their own technologies, their own servers. As Dominic said, it's more encryption. It's going to get harder and harder to intervene. So at some point, the private sector will have reached the end of what it can do. And then there's a question about cyber offensive capability and when is it right and proper for governments to take over? Because at present, there's huge gaps where terrorist use of the internet is concerned. And I'm not kidding, in terms of terrorist operated websites, there are several hundred that we're aware of, and we're not aware of anyone from any Five Eyes government actually doing anything to have these sites removed. And the reason is because there's no clear legal basis for them to do so, because it's not clear actually who is responsible to have a website domain taken down. No one actually knows. And as a consequence, terrorists are moving off Facebook and Twitter, and they're building their own websites, and no one knows what to do about it. So this isn't really a theoretical issue. It's that, well, actually, how can we have these sites removed in a way that's compatible with the rule of law? Because we're not really clear, and we don't think many other people are either.
Well, that strikes me as certainly a central issue to Virginia. It's not your part of the Home Office, but I don't know if you want to throw in a comment about how far the Home Office is actually currently engaged in going to the tech companies and demanding action be taken. I know they do this with content, unacceptable, say, child abuse content.
So as you say, it's not my immediate policy area, but yes, I mean, the engagement happens on terrorist and extremist content, and it happens obviously with child sexual exploitation imagery, and I suspect on hate crime material as well. I mean, sorry, just the security minister was asked earlier about the Computer Misuse Act. So certainly informally, our engagement on sort of informal sort of engagement and consultation with both law enforcement partners, intelligence and security agencies, and with the kind of sort of security sector. It's bubbling away. So it's not happening, even if it's not open for sort of formal consultation right now. But for example, things like domain name seizure, which some countries can do, but we can't at the moment, it's something we're aware of and looking at. Is probably as much as I can say.
Thank you indeed. Out of fairness to Craig Jones of Interpol, since I cited him and his question, I should say that he has put in the chat box that they are now very operationally focused, although it may not have been so in the past, and that's in response to Dominic's comment. We're almost out of time. Just one question, completely different question, that I'll just throw out to you all, if I may, from Professor Bernard Silverman, which, because so many researchers in the university, particularly at the PhD level, come from states that we would, well, some of them have been cited in this forum already, that we might be worried about. How do we protect ourselves against any potential risk that they might pose without, presumably, on the other hand, going to the point of excluding people on the basis simply of nationality, which would probably be unlawful? Any thoughts on that issue? It's been around for quite a long time in the counter-proliferation context, but this is a rather different context. We're now in the potential risks in the cybersecurity area. Kiersten, have you come across thinking on this subject?
Well, I have, and I do think it's a critical topic, because to your point, there's so many fine lines, and you know, in the United States, we're having a large conversation around diversity of thought and the need to solicit diversity of thought. And that gets represented through culture, through socioeconomic status, through gender, et cetera. So certainly when, you know, as I talk to people in the cybersecurity space, I talk about the fact that it's about building solutions and solving problems. And to do that effectively requires innovation and diversity of thought. All of that to say, we want to be able to attract and bring together bright minds that are not just focused on cybersecurity, but have come from other disciplines. And so I think oftentimes if we're dealing with it, once we're seeing applications or bringing in international students and we're discussing this problem at that point, it's too late. We really have to get to use our intelligence structure, our information sharing structures, better infrastructure to identify where security challenges are, and partnerships, trusted partnerships with countries, with universities, and facilitating it at the source. Again, being able to provide that. If we deem that goal to be important, which I certainly think we should, then we have to get, again, to this earlier place of what does it then mean to have those trusted relationships where we can be as sure as possible, as certain as possible. Obviously, it's all a risk management decision, but to have those relationships and those trusted partnerships ahead of time, because I think it becomes extremely critical to be able to have those to solicit that importance. In this space, global collaboration is going to be more critical to the solutions than ever before. And we absolutely have to work on this. And David, knowing that we're going to be shutting down, I do just want to say thank you to you and the team for this opportunity, and to Marc Lee and Mike Steinmetz and others, because I think this has been a tremendous opportunity.
Thank you very much. And let's just turn to the other panelists to see if you've got any short concluding remarks you want to make. Adam, you've turned your light on.
Well, no, other than to say thank you very much for the invitation to contribute today. If you'd like more information about what we do, we're at techagainstterrorism.org. Thank you very much.
Virginia?
Well, thank you very much for accepting me as at least a temporary substitute. I know this was an engagement the Security Minister was really keen to do, because it's a topic he's very, very engaged with. So thank you, and thank you for including us.
Dominic?
I think I echo the thanks. Really enjoyed the afternoon, quite apart from the fact it's very stimulating, and as usual, I've learned a great deal. As to the last question, I think it's pretty unanswerable. You have to, clearly, the potential input from people coming to do study and look into this area is very good, but equally, it can be exploited by those who actually want us to do us harm. This has been around for as long as you made the point about counter-proliferation. This has been around in exactly the same way. And I suspect there is no simple answer to it, except to be aware that it's a real possibility and has to be guarded against.
Thank you, Dominic. Well, in conclusion then, can I, on behalf of Cityforum, thank our speakers for their insights, for their candor in answering the questions. Thanks to everyone who participated and who posed questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of them, but I think in one way or another we covered most of the ground. And my thanks to obviously Marc Lee and Cityforum and Wilton Park, and to the sponsors of this event. Can I also say that if you want to network with each other, then get in touch with Cityforum and they'll be happy to pass email or contact information on as you might want. With that, Marc, back to you. We can't see you.
I think my communications from my Mendy Pilltop are completely impossible. Am I audible?
You're audible.
You are.
I'm audible. Well, again, thank you very much indeed to the panel, and thank you, to David, for sort of guiding us. This series has evolved into something, by our standards, sort of quite substantial, and we should be going on in the new year with Wilton Park and NSA, and look forward to having you variously in our projects again. And we're dependent upon a really good attendee list, and we're delighted to have had it today and look forward to having it in January and beyond. Many thanks for all your help. Thank you.
Very good. And with that, we'll close out. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the day.